Yeah, I'll react to that. Sure. All right. Yeah, I got Discord. Alabama man is Emperor of Rome. Oh, finish this. All right. You know what? That's what I'm gonna do. See. All right, everyone, get in my Discord. I think I just have to link it. All right. Emperor of Rome. Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna do that right now. I got you. All right. No, not Curse Forge. No. No. Okay. Alrighty. Let's do Admiral Yi. I'm cool with that. Admiral Yi, extra history. Not part 1. What part am I on? How you doing, guys? By the way, hope you're doing good. If you haven't seen my channel before, then it probably looks like quite a mess to you right now. I don't blame you. But we'd love to have you learn about history. Excuse me, my manners. I got this, guys. Don't worry. Ha. Ah. Okay, we're doing it.
Years. At last, we've passed the phase of Yi's life where his every effort is thwarted by the machinations of corrupt officials and jealous superiors. Finally, we can begin the story that sees Yi rise to be the national hero of Korea. But first, we have to talk about the two contrasting states that are about to meet in bloody battle. If you watched the Sengoku Jidai episodes, you'll remember that Japan had just come out of 100 years of ceaseless war. Their entire society was
100 years war. I gotta write that down. Who's it by? Kings of Germans. Okay. Yeah, 100 year. I feel like my next two major. Well, the War of the Roses really isn't that long. I only have 2 episodes left. It's 3 episodes long. But there's also 100 Years War. You guys are pointing that out. That actually, I think, precedes it. And someone said like the 7 Years War too, or 30 Years War. All those years wars. All right. Sorry.
Hierarchy in bloody battle. If you watched the Sengoku Jidai episodes, you'll remember that Japan had just come out of 100 years of ceaseless war. Their entire society was built off of a martial hierarchy, where the most glorious thing a man could do was fight. Japan had fielded giant armies and had an economy devoted to war. They had hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers, and they had
I love those spears.
Seasoned generals, battle-hardened from years of campaigning. And now, for the first time ever, all those forces were unified under one man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The Korean state had, by contrast, been mostly at peace for 200 years. The state itself was a Confucian bureaucracy, which should have meant that it was an enlightened meritocracy, but in truth, the Korean government was rotten to its core, full of factional infighting.
I don't know why that made me think of eunuchs, but were eunuchs a thing like everywhere, or was it mainly just East Asian thing? It's kind of a smart idea when it's cruel, but I'm gonna stop talking about that.
And led by a king who perhaps might have been a great leader in times of peace, but was utterly unsuited for a state of war. In terms of military thinking, the Japanese had spent years perfecting the art of war. The daimyos had become early adopters of the arquebus, and had rapidly innovated on firearm manufacturing and tactics. They had created movable field works to protect their gunners, coordinated the use of spears and arquebusiers, drilled the men to release large, simultaneous volleys to break up a charge, and trained them to wait to fire until they were within an effective range. They were such enthusiastic adopters of the arquebus that when the Japanese eventually arrived on Korean shores, about a quarter of their total force would be armed with this fearsome weapon. The Japanese had also become masters of the siege after so many decades of having to topple the highly wrought, master-crafted Japanese castles of the Sengoku age. The Koreans, on the other hand, had largely ignored the...
What year is this again? Okay, so it's the late 1500s.
Introduction of these castles of the Sengoku age. The Koreans, on the other hand, had largely ignored the introduction of personal firearms, and still relied mainly on the bow. But because the bow is a weapon that requires a great deal of training, and the Korean military was in a dissipated state, the actual number of effective troops they could field with this weapon was now very limited. The lists of who they could call to military service were...
So about the archers, would they, if this wasn't such a question I really want to ask, I wouldn't have paused it so quickly. All right. So would you have like recruited people like they do? I feel like in European sports, you guys tend to, most of you guys are European in my audience, like 80% of you. Like, would they like get someone at the age of like 12 and like put them in archery camp so that when they're of age to go to war, they're good? Or was it like a thing that a father and son would do? And then if you're really good, you would go into kind of military archer school, something like that. I'm curious how they would, like how long they would train archers for.
Were all out of date, and so the initial mustering of forces would lag behind. And Korean defensive troops they could field with this weapon, the Korean military was in a dissipated state, the actual number of effective troops they could field with this weapon was now very limited. The lists of who they could call to military service were all out of date, and so the initial mustering of forces would lag behind. And Korean defensive works were mostly just simple stone walls atop hills or mountains. But the Koreans did have two advantages. Since the war that had been burning through Japan for the last 100 years was a civil war, and thus mostly land-based, Japan hadn't built up its navy nearly as much as their other armed forces. Additionally, while Japan produced vastly superior handguns, the Koreans had developed better naval cannon. And this all makes sense when you think about what both of these forces were used to facing. Japanese forces were used to fighting large, organized land armies, and so they'd focused on developing the weapons and techniques required to counter them, whereas Korea had mostly dealt with pirates and raiders, so they built cannon to help defend their coast, and they built simple hill forts so that when raiders showed up, the people could hide in the forts and simply wait for the raiders to go away. They didn't need complex structures because the enemy Korea usually faced wasn't an enemy bent on conquest, but that was about to change. Between 15...
Okay, I was going to say, like, all right, how fortified is this, go away place? Is this, but the point is that they're not, the armies aren't these huge things coming, trying to conquer and kill or take over these citizens. They just want to plunder. And so these are just kind of like safe houses. Like, all right, they're here. We can't beat them right now. Just go into here. They'll take what they want and then leave.
They wait for the raiders to go away. They didn't need complex structures because the enemy Korea usually faced wasn't an enemy bent on conquest, but that was about to change. Between 1587 and 1592, emissaries raced back and forth between Japan and Korea. Hideyoshi wanted the Koreans to just let him march his armies through their lands in order to attack his intended target, China. But besides the fact that letting giant foreign armies march across your country is generally a bad idea,
yeah, it's not that easy, all right? Imagine... Like, all right, so like you have a house and someone's asking to like, you're like in the house in the middle of two neighbors who are fighting and you're in the middle of them two and one of the armies wants to go through and there's, all they want to do is get to the other neighbor. They just have to go through you. And it's not that easy if you're the house because like, okay, yeah, that's great, but what if on the way they wreck a bunch of stuff and then they like kill a few people and rape a few women and just it's not as easy as just like, oh, we're just going to go right through.
Koreans also happened to be tributary allies of the Chinese with strong cultural and economic ties, so letting this army march through uncontested was out of the question.
Okay,
this whole thing seemed like madness to them. The idea that the Japanese would even ask for such a thing was unfathomable to many in court. At first, they assumed the request must be a bluff, maybe a negotiating tactic that would eventually end in the Japanese asking for trade concessions or tribute or something.
So it's even worse because they kind of like the neighbor that you want to go attack.
Yu Sung-young saw further to what was really about to go down. And so he got Yi a naval appointment in the southwestern part of Korea and helped to make sure that he rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming the naval commander for the province by 1591. This is where Yi's story really begins. Upon taking command, Yi saw the dire straits the Navy was in and knew he had little time. He began drilling his men and instilling in them the spirit they needed for the war to come. He commissioned a new type of ship, the famous turtle ship, which he helped design. It was a remarkable piece of naval technology, with a spiked roof to keep enemy boarding parties out, and a dragon head prow that could serve as a cannon or billow out noxious smoke. But even before the first of these ships could see active service, it happened. Sentries all across the southeast coast began to spot ships coming over the horizon. Then tens of ships. Then hundreds. This massive fleet flew no sails known to Korean arms. Fires were lit and word this massive...
It's the Lancasters. Or the Yorks. Doesn't it look like War of the Roses? No, you don't... No?
Fleet flew no sails known to Korean arms. Fires were lit and word was spread. The Japanese were coming. But the local commanders refused to believe what they were seeing. They suggested that maybe it was a trade fleet, or maybe even a large tribute mission from the Japanese to apologize for how rude their ambassadors had been.
Or
And
maybe
so,
it's an invading army.
the local commanders did nothing. The approaching ships began to dock at Busan. Soldiers, fully armored and prepared for war, began to disembark from the ships, and still the local commanders did nothing. By nightfall, 300 ships full of warriors had landed. A Japanese army was now in Korea. Finally, the commanders realized what had just happened, but by now it was far too late. With well over 100 heavy Korean ships of war at the ready, they had just sat and watched this happen without even moving a single one of those ships out to scout the fleet.
So you can't be this stupid. He's up to something.
If they would have found out that this was a Japanese commander acting against orders. Eager to be the first to Korea, he had sailed his fleet before their warship arrived. Turns out nearly all of those hundreds of ships were unarmed transports. No match for the Korean Navy, which still sat anchored at port doing nothing.
So he kind of was right.
Force moved like lightning, smashing army after...
Okay, all right. So he's not as much... That is so clever. Oh, God.
Their army, crushing all in their way. Within the month, the Japanese were already in Seoul, 200 miles inland. Korean resistance had collapsed. And as the Japanese had pushed inland and moved out of Busan, the local commanders had scuttled their fleets. 100 Korean warships lost without a fight. But Busan's local commanders had sent word to Yi, asking for his help. So Yi set out with all 24 ships under his command, writing to other local commanders and telling them to rendezvous with him at sea. He left under cover of darkness and sailed through the night so his movements wouldn't be observed. By the time the various fleets met, they'd scraped together 45 warships and a handful of commandeered fishing ships. But Yi, despite never having commanded a battle at sea before, had a plan. He would fall on the Japanese while they were in harbor during the chaos of a sack. He found 50 of their vessels tied up at Okpo and descended upon them. The Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time. Japanese, despite never having commanded a battle at sea before, had a plan. He would fall on the Japanese while they were in harbor during the chaos of a sack. He found 50 of their vessels tied up at Okpo and descended upon them. The Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time, looting and slaughtering.
Okay, so rather than send all your troops right to where the Japanese are fighting, you kind of ignore that and go around and wreck their ships. That's a good idea.
Slaughtering the population. The roar of cannon. Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time, looting and slaughtering the population. The roar of cannon alerted them to their mistake. Yi and his fleet tore through the enemy ships, salvo after salvo ripping into the light wood of the Japanese vessels. The Japanese tried to mount a defense, but to no avail. Soon, their men were throwing their weapons and armor overboard and trying to swim for the shore. By nightfall, 26 Japanese ships rested at the bottom of the harbor. Only one Korean sailor was injured. Yi decided to disappear back into open water before his forces fell into the same trap he'd just sprung.
He got a splinter, like it wasn't even from them.
On his enemy. But as they sailed, open water before his forces fell into the same trap he'd just sprung on his enemy. But as they sailed, one of his outlying ships spotted 5 more Japanese warships. Yi fell upon them with a vengeance. Only one managed to escape. Then new reports came in of 13 more ships near Chinhae. When the sailors on those ships saw Yi, they abandoned their vessels entirely and fled on foot into the mountains. 43 Japanese ships sunk, and Yi had not lost a single vessel. He was promoted to General Command of the Southern Navy for his actions, but the sight of Japanese slaughtering civilians would stick with him forever and harden his resolve to defend the people of Korea. Join us next time as everyone else in Korea keeps losing.
That was so quick.
And Admiral
All right,
Yi
I'm going to do the next one soon. I am going to... There is a video that I would like to watch. No one recommended it, but yeah. All right, so I got you, and yeah, join the Discord. All right, or I have to link something. I don't know. All right, so I'll get one out soon. Hope you guys are good. See you guys next time. Soon.